All right, let's start here by talking central nervous system now. This is the part 13B, 15A, that lecture that we have online there. So here now, when we go through and we talk central nervous system, we've gone through and we've talked about the divisions there already. We've seen central nervous system is going to be made up of the brain and the spinal cord. So here now, when we go through and we talk about the brain and the spinal cord, we'll get the brain taken care of first, and then we'll check out the spinal cord. Now, when we go through and we talk brain, I'd like you to know the brain is described as being about four good fistfuls. It's described as being about four good fistfuls of a quivering, pinkish gray tissue. The brain is described as being wrinkled like a walnut. It's wrinkled like a walnut, and it has a consistency of that of cold oatmeal. Now, when we go through and we describe the brain is being described as weighing 3.5 pounds in the male and being about 3.3 pounds, 3.2 pounds in the female. So 3.5 pounds in the male and 3.2 pounds in the female. And now that's because of the body mass, brain mass equivalency basically in the sexes. Now, when we talk average male female brain weighs about 3.3 pounds. Okay. Now, when we go through and we talk brain development and whatnot, first what we want to do is we want to go through and look at the development of the nervous system, as we can see here on our slides. Now, when we go through and we talk about the development of the nervous system, what we're going to do is we're going to go through this process called neurulation, and we're going to look at the development of the nervous system here. So here, when we go through this process of neurulation, here we're going to see now, in this process of neurulation, here what we have is we're going to go through and we're going to look at this whole process of the formation of the neural tube is basically what we're getting at. Now here, okay, there we go. All right. So here now, when we go through and we talk about the development of the nervous system, first we've got this process of neurulation we want to look at. Now, here what's going to happen is you'll see around the third week. What's going to happen is the ectoderm thickens. Here we can move over to the next few slides. Here we can appreciate now basically the dorsal aspect. Here you can see that ectoderm starts to thicken. When the ectoderm starts to thicken, it's going to give rise to the neural plate, as we can see here. So the ectoderm thickens, right, forming that neural plate at the dorsal midline axis of the embryo. At the dorsal midline axis of the embryo. Now, this neural plate that we see here, this neural plate now itself is going to invaginate. Now, here you can see when we move over to the next slide, it invaginates and moves, you can see, to a more deeper position, forming for us what we refer to now as the neural groove. The neural groove itself is flanked by the neural folds, you can see there on both sides. Now, as this neural groove deepens, the superior edges of the neural folds are going to fuse. And when they fuse, you can see here forming for us our neural tube. The neural tube detaches and it sinks to a deeper position. So it detaches and it sinks to a deeper position. And there then we can see this neural tube. And the reason why this neural tube is important is because this neural tube then we're going to see is going to be formed in 1 week. You can see, so by the fourth week, you can see now that neural tube is formed. Now, this neural tube is important because this neural tube is going to differentiate into the central nervous system. It will differentiate into the CNS. Now, there's also some neural tube defects that I need you guys to know about. Now, neural tube defects, here we're going to see we've got basically, we can appreciate the development here in this picture as well, going through various stages. Same thing we can see here. And the same thing we're going to see in the next picture. And here we can see a couple of neural tube defects that I want you to know about. A few. First, we've got spina bifida. Second, then you've got microcephaly. And then we've got anencephaly. Now, spina bifida is going to occur, they say it's linked to a folic acid deficiency. So folic acid not being plentiful basically in the body, excuse me, at the time of the neural tube formation. Now here, when we talk spina bifida, you can see here we've got two different types. We've got occulta and we've got cystica. Now here, what's going to happen in this problem is the vertebrae is going to fail to enclose the spinal cord. So the spinal cord is not going to be found enclosed within the vertebra. And we talk occulta, it happens by affecting one to a few vertebrae, and there's no functional problems there. And then spina bifida cystica is the more severe form, where then the sac basically protrudes from that spine, and you can see basically even these components are going to be found then outside of the vertebra. And then you've got microcephaly, micro, the prefix you got there for small brain, and then anencephaly, you got there, basically these patients have no brain there. Now when we move over to the next slide, you can appreciate anencephaly here, and then we've got spina bifida we can appreciate here, and also spina bifida in this picture down here as well. Next then here, this neural tube is going to be important because this neural tube is going to give rise to the CNS. But before it gives rise to the CNS, here we're going to see it's going to form our it's going to form first our 3 primary brain vesicles we're going to go through, we're going to look at. And then those 3 you can see now are formed basically right after that 4th week. And then the 5th week, we're going to see here our secondary brain vesicles are going to appear, and then they're going to differentiate into the into the adult, basically into the adult brain structures that we're going to eventually have, we'll say. All right, so let's go through and let's talk about then these primary brain vesicles. So again, here you can see the formation of the neural tube. Same thing happening here. And then here you can actually see all the different brain structures. So when you say brain, it's not just one part. You can see there's a whole bunch of different parts there. Now here we can see the neural tube. The neural tube, now we can see is going to start to, its anterior end starts to take shape and starts to change shape basically there and gives rise to the CNS structures. So here you can see that neural tube before all of that happens. And here you can see the primary brain vesicles actually formed. So here we can see now when we talk primary brain vesicles, as soon as the neural tube forms, its anterior end begins to expand, forming the brain, and the remainder becomes the spinal cord. Excuse me, and the remainder is going to become the spinal cord. We've got here first prosencephalon, second mesencephalon, third then you've got rhombencephalon, forebrain, midbrain, and hindbrain we can say there as well. Now prosencephalon, mesencephalon, and rhombencephalon are going to give rise to secondary brain vesicles. Here we can appreciate our 5 secondary brain vesicles that you're required to know about there then. So telencephalon, diencephalon, mesencephalon continued on, and then metencephalon and myelencephalon, you can see there came from rhombencephalon. So prosencephalon gave rise to telencephalon and diencephalon. Now, when you talk secondary brain vesicles, you can see these secondary brain vesicles are going to give rise to adult brain structures. Now, those adult brain structures you can appreciate from each secondary brain vesicle. You can see right inside of here in the second column here, and then you've got the ventricles that are associated with each of those segments here in the last column. So when we talk telencephalon, or your end brain, it's going to give rise to the cerebrum. Talk cerebrum, you can see there it consists of your cerebral hemispheres. Now when you talk cerebral hemispheres, your cerebral hemispheres are going to consist of cortex, again the outer part, the bark, white matter, and also basal nuclei. And we'll go through and look at the cortices, white matter, and basal nuclei today in greater detail. Next then we've got our diencephalon. When we talk diencephalon is also known as the interbrain. It gives rise to the thalamus, hypothalamus, and epithalamus. So you can see there diencephalon in the retina. Diencephalon in the retina. And then we've got mesencephalon. Mesencephalon gives rise to the midbrain. That's going to be one segment, one division of the brain stem. And then metencephalon. Metencephalon will give rise to, we can see the pons, and then the cerebellum, also going to be formed here. And then last we have myelencephalon. Myelencephalon will give rise to the medulla oblongata of the brainstem, to the medulla oblongata. And then we said the rest is going to give rise to the spinal cord. So next up we've got the adult brain structures, so you can see all of them listed there. And here we can actually appreciate them then throughout development. So here you can see in week 5 you've got these flexures, basically this space here, the midbrain flexure, and then here we've got the cervical flexure. And you'll see they're going to start to move basically. And then they get eventually occupied by brain parts and fully basically occupied and completely disappear there then. As we can see there, to birth. So here then eventually are the adult brain structures. So they're formed there. What's going to happen now is just growth is going to occur. And they'll grow to then basically their sizes. So here then let's check out the general organization now. Let's check out the adult brain regions. We've got first the cerebral hemispheres. You can appreciate here is one of the cerebral hemispheres. On the other side then would be the other one. And then diencephalon, you can appreciate right inside of here. And then we've got the brain stem, which is made up of midbrain, pons, and then we said the medulla oblongata. And the rest, spinal cord. So ventricles then. We talk ventricles now. Ventricles, I want you to know, are going to be fluid-filled chambers. They are fluid-filled continuous enlargements. You can think of fluid-filled continuous enlargements formed by the central cavity of the neural tube. Formed by the central cavity of the neural tube. So like I said, they're continuous with one another. They are continuous with one another. Not only are they continuous with one another, but they're also going to be continuous with the central canal of the spinal cord. They will also be continuous with the central canal of the spinal cord. These ventricles, we'll see, are going to be filled with CSF. They are filled with cerebral spinal fluid. And then they are lined by ependymal cells. They are lined by ependymal cells. One type of neuroglia that we've gone through, we've talked about, you should recall. So let's go through and let's check out these ventricles in greater detail. First, we can appreciate here our lateral ventricles. Now, when we talk lateral ventricles, the lateral ventricles are going to be found as a pair. So from the anterior view, you can appreciate both of them there. And then from the lateral view, you can appreciate both of them there as well. So they're found as a pair. They're paired in the cerebral hemispheres, large, C-shaped chambers. Like the letter C. C-shaped chambers. Anteriorly, you can see from the anterior view, anteriorly, they lie close together. You can see here, they're found lying close together. However, they are separated. They're going to be separated by the septum pellucidum. So they're separated from each other by the septum pellucidum. And we'll talk about that in a few seconds. Now, these ventricles are so big, they get divided up into different horns. So here we're going to be able to appreciate first the anterior horns. Back here you've got the posterior horns. And then down here we've got the inferior horns. So septum pellucidum. The septum pellucidum, I want you to know, is a thin median membrane, a transparent wall you could think of. Next, then we have our third ventricle. Now, the third ventricle is a narrow, fluid-filled chamber. It's a narrow, fluid-filled chamber. And the third ventricle is found in the diencephalon. And it communicates with the lateral ventricles. It communicates with the lateral ventricles. And it communicates with the lateral ventricles, you can see here from this anterior view, via the interventricular foramina, or the foramen of Monroe. So you can see there's two of them. They allow each of these ventricles to communicate with the third ventricle. Next then we have the cerebral aqueduct. So we're moving down to the fourth ventricle. Now between the third and the fourth ventricles, you have the cerebral aqueduct. So the cerebral aqueduct is going to allow third, you can say it connects the third and the fourth ventricles. It's canal-like, so hence the name aqueduct. Next then we've got our fourth ventricle. So, sorry about that. So here when we go through and we talk then the fourth ventricle, now we're going to be able to appreciate here very well from the anterior view and then here from this lateral view. Now when we talk fourth ventricle, the fourth ventricle is going to be found in the hindbrain. So in the hindbrain, dorsal to the pons, and superior to the medulla. So again, the third and the fourth ventricle will communicate with one another, with each other, via the cerebral aqueduct. So fourth ventricle is going to be found located dorsal to the pons and superior to the medulla. And then here we can appreciate these apertures. You've got your lateral apertures, and here you can see the median aperture. Now these apertures are going to basically connect the ventricles to the subarachnoid space. And that's a fluid-filled space again. That's going to be found surrounding the brain. And you guys will see that in the next chapter in greater detail. Now let's look at the central nervous system arrangement. Let's look at the CNS arrangement. We're going to basically look at how this white matter and gray matter are going to be organized. So here we can go through and we can look at first these different regions of basically the cerebellum, the brainstem, and then you can see the spinal cord there as well. So here now, we're looking at the pattern of gray and white matter in the central nervous system. Now here, first you can see we've got the central cavity. The central cavity right at the center, fluid-filled space, right? We've talked about that and we've checked that out. Now here then you can see surrounding that central cavity is going to be inner gray matter core. The inner gray matter core. This inner gray matter core is going to be gray matter, mostly neuron cell bodies. It is again gray matter, mostly neuron cell bodies. Next then we've got the outer white matter. You can appreciate then this outer white matter. Now this outer white matter is going to be white matter again, and it's mostly myelinated fiber tracts. Next then we have gray matter nuclei. Now when we talk gray matter nuclei, here we're going to be able to go through and we're going to be able to see now, when we talk gray matter nuclei, now gray matter nuclei are going to be basically found, now you can see here, at the level of that cerebellum, right inside of there. And then we've got some more gray matter nuclei you can appreciate here at the level of the brainstem. Next then we have the cortex of gray matter. Now we talk cortex of gray matter again. That's only going to be appreciated in certain regions. Here we can see at the region of the cerebellum, we've got this cortex of gray matter right outside of there. And we will look at this again when we look at and we talk about the cerebral hemispheres. So let's go through and let's look at then the cerebral hemispheres now, the first component of this central nervous system in greater detail. So we've got a nice view here, and then we can appreciate this view here. Same thing here with these next few views there as well. So when we talk cerebral hemispheres, I want you to know these cerebral hemispheres are going to form the superior part of the brain. They form the superior part of the brain. The cerebral hemispheres, they cover and they obscure the diencephalon. They cover and they obscure the diencephalon. And you can see that there very well. This is an image that's showing you actually through the hemispheres. But that's not normally what you would find. So you can see the cerebral hemispheres are going to cover and obscure the diencephalon and the top of the brainstem. And the top of the brainstem. Now there's markings here that we can appreciate as well. Now these markings we can appreciate on the hemispheres. You can see here very well the gyri. Now these gyri are elevated ridges of tissue. They are elevated ridges of tissue on the surface of the cerebral hemispheres. Elevated ridges of tissue on the surface of the cerebral hemispheres. Now, between these gyri, you can appreciate sulci. Now, the sulci are going to be shallow grooves. They will be shallow grooves that you can appreciate now right inside of there. So here, all right, so here we can appreciate then again gyri and the sulci. So when we talk sulci, sulci are going to be, again, we've got, play from current slide. So when we talk sulci, sulci are going to be the shallow grooves. The shallow grooves you can appreciate in between these elevated ridges of tissue, between these gyri. Now when we talk fissures, fissures then are going to be deeper grooves. They will be deeper grooves, or you can think of a deep sulci, or a deep sulci. Next in here, we've got two fissures, so deeper grooves, or a deep sulci. Now these fissures, we'll see, there's two of them that I want you to know about. First, you're going to be able to appreciate, you've got longitudinal fissure. Now the longitudinal fissure is found separating the cerebral hemispheres at the midline. So first fissure you have is a longitudinal fissure. The longitudinal fissure separates the cerebral hemispheres at the midline. Next then you have your transverse cerebral fissure. Now the transverse cerebral fissure is going to be found now separating the cerebral hemispheres, you can see above, found separating the cerebral hemispheres from the cerebellum below. From the cerebellum below. So two major fissures we want to cover there as well. And then we'll have a lateral sulcus we'll talk about also. You can appreciate right inside of here. So we'll talk sulci as we progress as well. Next, then let's go through and let's talk and let's look at the divisions of the brain, the cerebral hemispheres, into lobes. So let's see how they're divided up into lobes. Here you're going to be able to appreciate basically all the different lobes I'd like you to know about. Here you've got the frontal lobe. We're going to go through, we're going to check out, and we're going to talk about that. We're going to see the parietal lobe. And then we've got the occipital lobe. And then here we've got the temporal lobe. And then the fifth lobe is going to be the insula. The insula. So here you can see now 5 lobes in total. There's 5 lobes in total. They're divided by the sulci, divided and separated from one another by the sulci. And they're named. These lobes are named for the cranial bones that overlie them. They're named for the cranial bones that overlie them. First, you've got the frontal lobe. Frontal lobe now is going to be separated from the parietal lobe thanks to the central sulcus. So here you can appreciate the central sulcus. And you can see it's found separating that frontal lobe from the parietal lobe. Next, then we're going to be able to appreciate that parietal lobe. The parietal lobe, you can see here very nicely. Now, in relation to the frontal lobe and parietal lobe, we've got your precentral gyrus and your postcentral gyrus. Precentral gyrus, you can see, is going to be found anterior to the central sulcus. So you got to listen to the terms. Precentral gyrus, anterior to the central sulcus. Postcentral gyrus, dorsal, posterior to that central sulcus. And they're going to be two important structures we're going to go through and we're going to talk about. So there is your parietal lobe. Parietal lobe then is separated from this occipital lobe thanks to the parietal occipital sulcus. Thanks to the parietal occipital sulcus. Next then we've got the occipital lobe. You can appreciate at the most dorsal aspect there then of the cerebral hemispheres. And here coming out laterally you've got the temporal lobe. Now the temporal lobe, you've got the lateral sulcus in relation to the temporal lobe. This lateral sulcus is going to be found separating this temporal lobe from the frontal lobe and this parietal lobe. So it separates frontal and parietal lobes from that temporal lobe. Then the fifth lobe is the insula. In order to appreciate the insula, we're going to have to basically move all those various segments over. And here you can see the insula is going to be found buried deep within that lateral sulcus. So buried deep within the lateral sulcus. And it's going to form part of the floor. It forms, you can see there, part of the floor. Now let's go through and let's look at the cortices. Let's talk about the cerebral cortices. So when we talk cerebral cortices, moving back to this diagram here, we can appreciate, again, all of this outer bark region is basically what it's described as looking like or similar to. So that's what we're going to go through. We're going to check out and we're going to look at now, the cortices. Now the cerebral cortices, I want you to know, very important region here. That's why we're going to go through. We're going to talk about it. The cerebral cortices, they enable us to be aware of ourselves. They're going to allow us to be aware of ourselves, our sensations. They're going to allow us to communicate. The cortices will allow us to communicate, remember, understand, and initiate voluntary movements. Now the cerebral cortex is composed of gray matter. It's composed of gray matter, neuron cell bodies, dendrites, glial cells, and blood vessels. No fiber tracts. Let's first discuss the motor areas. So the cortices that are responsible for motor innervation. Now we talk motor areas, they're going to control voluntary movements. So we talk motor areas, first you have what we call the primary motor cortex. So here we can appreciate now from this view here, the primary motor cortex. Now we talk primary motor cortex. Primary motor cortex is going to be found located on the precentral gyrus of each hemisphere in the frontal lobe. So primary motor cortex located on the precentral gyrus of each hemisphere in the frontal lobe. Function of the primary cortex, of the primary motor cortex. So right inside of here you can see the function of the primary motor cortex is going to be that it consciously controls precise or skilled voluntary movements of our skeletal muscles. We have pyramidal cells here. These pyramidal cells are large neurons. They're large neurons whose fibers are going to leave the cortex and connect to other parts of the CNS. Then we have the term somatotropy there. Basically there we're talking about how different body basically regions we have been mapped out. So basically when we talk somatotropy, it's talking about the mapping out of the body in the CNS structures. So for example, we're going to see which part of the cortex is going to be responsible for providing innervation, motor innervation to the foot, to the elbow, to the face. Okay, so here you can see we've got the homunculus that goes through and depicts that here very well for us. So you got to be able to understand now if there's an injury to this area here, these parts of the body are going to have motor innervation being affected there. And as you progress out laterally, you can see the different parts of the body that these different parts of the brain are going to control. Next, then we've got the premotor cortex. Now, when we talk premotor cortex, you can see the premotor cortex now. The premotor cortex is going to be found located anterior to the precentral gyrus. Anterior to the precentral gyrus, or you can say anterior to the primary motor cortex. It's the same exact thing there. In the frontal lobe. In the frontal lobe. Now the functions of this premotor cortex I'd like you to know about now are going to be that it controls learned motor skills of a repetitious or patterned nature, such as playing a musical instrument or typing, dancing even, where the coordination of several muscle groups is going to be required. So it coordinates the movement of several muscle groups. Next, we can appreciate Broca's area. When we talk Broca's area is present in the left hemisphere only. It's present in the left hemisphere only. It's found lying anterior to the inferior region of the premotor area. Anterior to the inferior region of the premotor area. Its function then, the function of Broca's area is that it directs the muscles involved in speech production. Next, then we have our frontal eye field. When we talk about the frontal eye field is located partially in and anterior to the premotor cortex. Partially anterior to the premotor cortex and superior to Broca's area. So here you can appreciate in red the frontal eye field. Now we talk frontal eye field functions. It controls voluntary movements of the eyes. It will control voluntary movements of the eyes. So it controls voluntary movement of the eyes. So those are our motor areas. As you can see, they're being depicted in red. Let's move then to the sensory areas. Now the sensory areas are going to be concerned with conscious awareness of sensation. They will be concerned with conscious awareness of sensation. So it's going to be the dark and the light blue areas. Let's talk first the primary somatosensory cortex. When we talk primary somatosensory cortex, it's going to be found located in the post-central gyrus. So it's found located in the post-central gyrus of the parietal lobe. Found located in the post-central gyrus of the parietal lobe, posterior to the primary motor cortex. Posterior to the primary motor cortex. Now when we talk function, the function we'll see, you can see primary somatosensory cortex. So when we talk function, function is going to be that it receives information. It receives information from the general sensory receptors. It receives sensory information. So it's receiving information from the general sensory receptors in the skin and from proprioceptors. and also from proprioceptors. These are going to be receptors that are found in relation to your skeletal muscle, to your joints, and to your tendons. So all this information is going to make its way then to our primary somatosensory cortex. So it receives information from our general sensory receptors that are found located throughout the skin and also from our proprioceptors. Then again, somatotropy we've got here as well. So just like we saw with motor innervation, we've got the same thing happening with sensory innervation, and you can see that homunculus right inside of there. Same thing you can see here. Okay, and the same thing you can see there as well. I just like these images a little bit better, so that's why I've kept them there. Same thing here as well. So sensation, you can see to all the different areas, starting with this area that's just, you can see within that longitudinal fissure, you've got it controlling the genitals all the way to the feet, and then coming around the ankles, and you can see making your way around. Laterally now, you can see the different parts of the body being basically responsible for sending sensory information to that part of the brain. So let's move to then your somatosensory association cortex. To the somatosensory association cortex. Now, when we talk somatosensory association cortex, it's found lying posterior to the primary somatosensory cortex. It's found lying posterior to the primary somatosensory cortex that we just talked about. So right back here, you can see the somatosensory association cortex. Now, when we talk somatosensory association cortex, its function is to integrate sensory input. It'll integrate sensory input, basically temperature and pressures, to produce an understanding then. So it integrates sensory inputs to produce an understanding. Even if you stick your hands in your pocket and you say, okay, here, sensory receptors are giving me this information. Okay, here I've got chapstick. Here are my keys. Here's a dime. Here's a quarter. Here's a dollar bill. I don't know, is it 5 or 20 or that? I mean, we're not that good with, but at least we know this is money, or maybe even regular paper. You could confuse it for there as well. So again, the somatosensory association cortex is going to integrate sensory inputs to help produce then an understanding. So it integrates basically this information from the objects that are being felt or seen, or temperature being sensed, and then it helps to produce then an understanding. Next thing, we have our primary visual cortex. Now, our primary visual cortex is going to be found located at the extreme posterior tip of the occipital lobe. At the extreme posterior tip of the occipital lobe. So at the extreme posterior tip of the occipital lobe. And here you can see that right inside of here. I'm going to move over to another view, and this other view is going to be basically a nice medial cut along that longitudinal fissure, and you're going to be able to see this here very well. So this parasagittal view, we can say here, you can see the rest of that primary visual cortex. So when we talk primary visual cortex, I told you it's at the extreme posterior tip of the occipital lobe, but most of it is going to be buried deep in the calcarine sulcus. So it's buried deep in that calcarine sulcus in the medial aspect of that occipital lobe. So in that medial aspect of the occipital lobe. So again, extreme posterior tip of the occipital lobe, but most of it is buried deep in that calcarine sulcus in the medial aspect of that occipital lobe. Now the function, let's talk function of this primary visual cortex. So coming back out, you can see primary visual cortex right inside of there again, and then you can see the majority of it is buried deep within that calcarine sulcus. So it receives visual information that originates on the retina of the eye. It receives visual information that originates on the retina of the eye. Next, then we have our visual association area. So moving back out, or you can appreciate the visual association area there as well. Moving back out, you can see our visual association area. It's found surrounding the primary visual cortex. It is found surrounding the primary visual cortex and covers most of that occipital lobe, as you can see. And it covers most of that occipital lobe. When we talk function, you'll see it's going to use past visual experiences. It will use past visual experiences to interpret visual stimuli, enabling us then to recognize what we are seeing. Enabling us to recognize what we are seeing. Next, we can appreciate the primary auditory cortex. The primary auditory cortex. Now, when we talk primary auditory cortex, the primary auditory cortex is going to be found located at the superior margin of the temporal lobe. At the superior margin of the temporal lobe, you can see that there very nicely. And they say it's abutting right next to, abutting or right next to, A-B-U-T-T-I-N-G, abutting, or right next to the lateral sulcus. The function of the primary auditory cortex, you'll see its function now is that it interprets sound for pitch. It will interpret sound for pitch, loudness, and location. Loudness and location. And then you can see right next to it is the auditory association area. So we talk about auditory association area. This auditory association area is going to be found posterior to the primary auditory cortex. So just posterior to, so you can think lateral and posterior to the primary auditory cortex. Now the auditory association area, it permits the perception of sound stimulus as speech, a scream, and music, or even music. So it's going to permit the perception of sound stimuli as speech, a scream, or music being played. This is where we store sound memories then. This is where we store sound memories. These association areas. Next up, we've got our primary olfactory cortex. Now, we talk primary olfactory cortex. It's involved with the sense of smell. It's going to be found located on the medial aspect of the temporal lobe. Found located on the medial aspect of the temporal lobe. On the piriform lobe, they also refer to it as. So we'll look at that in a few seconds. Now this primary olfactory cortex, when you look at its shape, you'll see it's got like a hook part to it. It's got like this part that looks like a hook to it. And it's a little hook-like part that's called an uncus. You can see that here very well. So here's the primary olfactory cortex. And then here's the uncus, the hook-like part of it, right inside of there. Function, primary olfactory cortex, its function is to give us conscious awareness of different odors. It will give us conscious awareness of different odors. Next, then we have the gustatory cortex. When we talk gustatory cortex, the gustatory cortex is, when we talk location, you'll see the gustatory cortex is in the insula deep to the temporal lobe. So here you can see gustatory cortex in the insula deep to the temporal lobe. Function of the gustatory cortex? Function is that it's involved in the perception of taste stimuli. It is involved in the perception of taste stimuli. Next time we've got our visceral sensory area. Now our visceral sensory area you can't see. So when you talk location, I'll tell you location. Location is going to be the cortex of the insula. Cortex of the insula, posterior to the gustatory cortex. You can't actually see it, but it's described as being at the cortex of the insula, posterior to the gustatory cortex. Now, when we talk function of this visceral sensory area is it's involved in the perception of visceral sensations. It is involved in the perception of visceral sensations. Upset stomach, full bladder, let's say, for example. All thanks to then this visceral sensory area. Next, we have our vestibular cortex. Now we talked vestibular cortex. Vestibular cortex, you'll see, is going to be involved in maintaining equilibrium. Maintaining equilibrium. So when we talk vestibular cortex, the vestibular cortex, the location again, unknown exact location. Unknown exact location. We can't see it. However, we believe it's posterior. It's at the posterior part of the insula. It's at the posterior part of the insula and adjacent to the parietal cortex. And adjacent to the parietal cortex. Now, when we talk function, you'll see it's going to be involved in the awareness of balance. It's involved in the awareness of balance and the position of the head in space. And the position of our head in space. Next, then we have our multimodal association areas. Now, when we talk about our multimodal association areas, I'd like you to know there's a couple of different parts here we're going to go through, we're going to look at. First, we have what we call the anterior association area. The anterior association area is also known as the prefrontal cortex. Again, prefrontal cortex. Remember, we're still talking about the cortices. So the prefrontal cortex you can appreciate here, then in pink. Purple, pink, pink, I think. Yeah, I guess this is like that gold dress or shoe or whatever it was, and I don't even know the color or even the object, so forget that. Or the black dress or whatever it was there. So you can appreciate the anterior association area here then, or prefrontal cortex, we also refer to it as. Now again, the location on the frontal lobe. Now when you talk function is that it's involved with intellect. It's involved with intellect, complex learning abilities, recall, our ability to recall, and personality. And personality. Next then is the posterior association area. Now you can look at the posterior association area and you can appreciate that right back here is the same color there now as well as the anterior association area. Now when we talk posterior association area, it's a large region encompassing, you can see, the temporal lobe, parietal lobe, and parts of the occipital lobe. Function of this posterior association area is that it recognizes patterns and faces. It recognizes patterns and faces, localizing us and our surroundings. Localizing us and our surroundings. Now, Wernicke's area, just like Broca's area, are found on the left hemisphere only. Both only present on the left hemisphere. So we talk Wernicke's area. Wernicke's area is involved in understanding, or you can say it's involved in the recognition of written and spoken language. So it's involved in understanding written and spoken language. I can't see myself when I'm recording, so I don't know, what I look like or what's going on. I find out afterwards. Sorry. Don't know lighting or anything. I tried to fix it the best I could before I started, but we'll see afterwards. So Wernicke's area, present on the left hemisphere only, just like we said with Broca's area as well. Okay. So next, let's move down. Let's talk limbic association area. Let's talk limbic association area. So here then we can move, and again, look at this is all we've talked about is the cortices. So you see just that outer border highlighted there. Same thing here as well. Limbic system. Let's talk limbic association system. So here, limbic association area. Now, when we talk limbic association area, it's going to include a few structures. So it's going to include the cingulate gyrus. It will include the cingulate gyrus. It'll include the amygdala, and the hippocampus. So the prominent components making up this limbic system are going to be the amygdala, cingulate gyrus, and the hippocampus. Now the function is it's involved with emotion and memory. It's involved with emotion and memory. Okay, you can say kind of it provides us with the emotional impact that makes a scene important to us. So emotion and memory. We had the term ipsilateralization that we used before. Now the term lateralization is there. Now when we talk lateralization and contralateralization, basically it's going into and it's talking about how some parts of the body, their function is going to be controlled by the same side brain, or sometimes when we talk contralateralization, you'll see the right side brain will control parts on the left side. So that's basically what these two terms there are in reference to. Next, then let's move down to white matter, cerebral white matter. When we talk cerebral white matter, it's going to consist mainly of myelinated fibers, So here's a good view depicting that to us there. And then we can see the same thing right inside of here besides basal nuclei. And same thing we can see here. Now, when we talk cerebral white matter, its function is that it's involved, it's responsible for communication. It's responsible for communication between cerebral areas and between the cerebral cortex and lower CNS structures. So responsible for communication between cerebral areas and between the cerebral cortex and lower CNS centers. Here you have commissures I want you to be familiar with. Now when we talk commissures are going to be basically helping to connect corresponding gray areas of the two hemispheres. They help connect corresponding gray areas of the two hemispheres, enabling them to function as a coordinated whole. There's a couple of different types of commissures that you'll have to know about. The first type is going to be your corpus callosum. Now we talk corpus callosum. Here you can appreciate the corpus callosum from this view here, where they've done basically you can see there a nice coronal cut, and through this coronal cut now you can appreciate those commissural fibers. But in order to appreciate this commissure in greater detail, what we can do is we can move over to this picture right inside of here. You can see that corpus callosum right inside of there. So look at this image versus this image, this detailed image of those fibers. So corpus callosum, it's the largest commissure located superior to the lateral ventricle. And deep in the longitudinal fissure. We also have anterior and posterior commissures. Here we're going to be able to appreciate then the anterior and posterior commissures. Here we've got the anterior commissure, again, connecting corresponding gray areas of the two hemispheres. And here we've got the posterior commissures right inside of there. And they're less prominent commissures compared to that corpus callosum. Next, then, move back to this image and we can see the association fibers. And we talk association fibers. Now, the association fibers are going to connect different parts of the same hemispheres. So here you can see in that pink, or bright kind of a pink, you can see all of these various association fibers. So again, these association fibers, they're going to connect different parts of the same hemispheres. Some are long and some are going to be short, but they connect different parts of the same hemisphere. Then you have your projection fibers. Now when we talk projection fibers, the projection fibers are going to be sending sensory information to the cerebral cortex. They'll send sensory information to the cerebral cortex. And they take motor output and take motor output. So here you can appreciate those association fibers we saw here. And now here are the projection fibers. All projection fibers. Up this way and up this way here. Now in relation to these projection fibers, you've got a couple of divisions or a couple structures in relation to them. First, you've got the internal capsule. Now the internal capsule you can appreciate right inside of here and right inside of here. Basically, it's a collection or a compact band of projection fibers. It's a collection of projection fibers found at the top of the brain stem. Found right at the top of the brain stem. So you can see here, you've got the medulla, you've got the pons, and then we're going to have the midbrain. And then right up here, commissures. You're going to have the peduncles, the cerebellar peduncles. And then right inside of here, if we're moving a little bit more anterior, right, and then here you can appreciate the internal capsules. And then here, as you continue up further into the cortices, you can appreciate this fan-like radiating pattern of these projection fibers. That's the corona radiate. The corona radiate. So the fan-like fibers radiating through the cerebral white matter to reach the cortex. Next then we have our basal nuclei. When we talk basal nuclei are going to be masses of cerebral gray matter. Masses of cerebral gray matter embedded deep in the white matter. Embedded deep in the white matter. So first we have the corpus striatum. When we talk corpus striatum it consists of the lentiform nucleus and the caudate nucleus. Let's talk caudate nucleus. Caudate nucleus, then you can appreciate just inferior to the lateral ventricles bilaterally on both sides. And then we've got the lentiform nucleus. The lentiform nucleus, you can see inferior to that caudate nucleus on both sides. It's made up of the putamen and the globus pallidus. The putamen and the globus pallidus. Putamen and globus pallidus. Now the function of this whole basal nuclei, the whole function of the basal nuclei is that it influences muscle movement. So motor control. And it helps to regulate attention and cognition. It helps to regulate attention and cognition. It's also going to regulate the intensity of slow or stereotyped movements. And it inhibits antagonistic and unnecessary movements. And it will help inhibit antagonistic and unnecessary movements. So this will conclude then this first part of chapter 15 and the last part of 13 there.